He reached inside past a display of colorful clothing. The chest seemed solidly built, but the backboard felt surprisingly thin. He discovered that a gentle push would raise it up. He leaned into the chest, getting on all fours to look inside. Where he expected a wall, there was an open space. It was a secret tunnel. He could see a dim light. Bang, a voice said playfully. Jinchi discovered a gun muzzle right up to his face. Lulan was there in the tunnel and she was holding a firearm. It was far more complex than the Feifa Jinchi knew. It was similar to the one Shishu had fired earlier, but smaller and more portable. It could even fit in a cramped space like this one. He was shocked to realize they hadn't just been producing fire powder here, but also the newest firearms. Allow me to call you Master Jinchi. For convenience, Lulan said, still holding the gun on him. She was covered in soot and her hair was scorched. The candle in the candle holder she carried flickered each time she spoke. Would you be so kind as to come with me? What if I refuse? If I was willing to let you refuse, I wouldn't be threatening you. Jinchi was almost impressed by her audacity. He looked at the current model Feifa, taking in all the new and different things about it. He raised his hands, understood, and with that he followed Lulan into the tunnel. The blueprints Jinchi had studied hadn't shown any secret tunnels. Maybe that would have defeated the purpose of keeping them secret, or perhaps Shishu had added this passage only recently. The tunnel was narrow, and Lulan walked backward so she could keep the gun on Jinchi. It might have been easier with Jinchi walking in front and Lulan holding the gun at his back, but she was probably wary of the possibility that he would attempt to take the weapon from her as he went to walk in front of her. I'm a little surprised you're just coming with me, Lulan said. And yet you're the one who told me to, he replied almost nonchalantly. Lulan giggled. He found that she seemed much more human than she had been in the rear palace. Would it be easy enough for you to take this from me? Jinchi could not be certain, but he suspected he would be able to overpower her. He did not say that and remained silent. There was not much air in the tunnel, so the candle kept flickering. Just before the candle went out, they arrived at a secret room. The candle flame regained its strength. An opening must have been letting in air, and its light illuminated two other women. One was a young lady who looked much like Lulan. She had a dark bruise on her face. Oh, Suhari, my dear sister, has she already done anything awful to you? The other woman shook her head. Her movements were short and quick. Suhari was the name of the palace woman who had returned from the dead. This was the face of the eunuch who had entered the rear palace recently. Then Jinchi looked at the third woman in the room. She was middle-aged and wearing clothing and makeup that struck him as outrageous. He thought she lacked the dignity appropriate for her age. It reminded him of how Lulan had been in the rear palace. The only furniture in the room was 2 chairs and a single desk. Lulan, the middle-aged woman, began, Is this man? Yes, mother. I brought him here to make your wish come true. Lulan's mother, Shenmei, glowered at Jinchi with undisguised fury, but Lulan went on, I know how much you have always hated him. His appearance, is it because of who he reminds you of, or simply because you have always been jealous of him, always resented how much more beautiful he is than you? Lulan, Shenmei snapped at her daughter. Lulan did not even flinch. Instead, Suari trembled. She seemed very different from what Jinchi had been told. I'm sorry, that was perhaps too much for a joke. Let me put on a little performance for you, a warm-up before the main event. Then she set down the candle, tucked the Feifa into her sash, and calmly, clearly began to tell a story. Lulan's story took place during the time of the previous emperor. The ruler was rather imbecilic and had been his mother's puppet when conducting politics. This was a very disrespectful way to talk about the former emperor. What kept Jinchi from getting mad about it was knowing it was all true. Jinchi had never thought the man he called father was frightening. But the woman who stood behind him, the Empress Regnant, was terrifying. Jinchi chased a wisp of an old memory. He didn't really know what the end of the Empress Regnant's life had been like. All he remembered was that the former emperor had passed on quickly, as if hurrying to follow his mother into the next life. Increasingly impatient with her son's lack of interest in grown women, the Empress Regnant had filled the rear palace with the most beautiful ladies. And then she had instructed the chieftain of one of the northern families to offer his daughter. She was to be set up, at least outwardly, as one of the ruler's high consorts. What are you saying, Lulan? Shenmei asked, puzzled by her daughter's tale. The story was not going quite the way she knew it. Lulan covered her mouth with her sleeve and giggled. "Is this the first time you have heard this story, mother? My grandfather mumbled it like a mantra on his deathbed as he wasted away from illness. There was nothing new about the idea of making a high official's daughter a consort. It was done effectively to hold her hostage. It had happened throughout history. Do you know why the rear palace got so large?" Lulan asked Jinshi. "I've heard it was at the instigation of your father, whispering in the ear of the Empress Regnant. That was the general view within the court. People believed that Shishu had wormed his way into the inner circle of the notoriously cagey Empress Regnant. Shishu had once been the unremarkable son of a branch of the Shi family. However, through his own cleverness and the blood he inherited, he was adopted by the main house. The main house needed an heir, and so he was given the name Shishu. That main house was Shenmei's family. She had been betrothed to Shishu since before she was gifted to him by the emperor." "That's right," Lulan said. "I believe he suggested expanding the rear palace as a new public works program." Jinshi thought it was a nice way of putting it. A way of avoiding the issue arose whenever the question of the rear palace's diminishing size came up. He proposed it in connection with the slave trade. That caused Jinshi's eyes to widen. Shenmei looked as surprised as he did. Suhari, meanwhile, remained expressionless. Lulan giggled at Jinshi. Then she looked at Shenmei. "You really did not know any of this, did you, mother? You do not know what grandfather did to draw the Empress Regnant's ire? Why he had to offer his daughter to the rear palace to keep her in line? Slavery had been alive and well at that time. The palace had even been staffed by enslaved eunuchs." However, Lulan had mentioned the slave trade. Li's government supported slavery using principles similar to those for its brothels. A person could be considered emancipated when they had worked long enough to repay their purchase price, or they could be free after fulfilling a set term of service, but this was true only within the nation's borders. The export of slaves to other countries was supposed to be forbidden. However, it seems slaves are quite a profitable commodity. Forbidden or not, there is no end of people eager to get their hands on the profits. At the time, young ladies brought an especially high price. With one of its most prominent daughters now held hostage, the Shi clan had been forced to scale down its slave trading operation. The trade did not disappear entirely, however. What remained was said to center around the rear palace. It involved not just young women, but often men. These men were frequently castrated before they were sold off as slaves. This had been Shishu's suggestion. He proposed using the rear palace to shelter the women who would otherwise have been sold abroad. His thoughts aligned perfectly with those of the Empress Regnant. She considered his proposal a way to achieve two goals at once politically and concerning her son. Parents felt guilt when selling their daughters. If they had a choice, they would rather see their daughters serve in the rear palace than be taken away as slaves. 2 years of service would likely leave them with skills or education. This would lessen the chance they would fall into slavery afterward. Above all, serving in the rear palace was a distinguished qualification. Unfortunately, with the dramatic expansion of the rear palace, the plans for education had come to little. But of course, the Empress Regnant had more than one plan, and so did my father. By gaining the Empress Regnant's trust, he hoped to repair the reputation of the Shi clan. And if that proved impossible, I know things have been hard for you, mother. If this was where it was going to end, I wish you had run away before it all started. Your father went to so much trouble to give you the chance. Was she referring to the secret passage out of the rear palace? Was that why it had been? Jinshi wondered. Shenmei's face looked like a storm. Was it because you didn't trust a man who said he would give up his position to leave with you? Lulan, you little one. Deep creases formed on Shenmei's face as she looked at her daughter. It was not Lulan, however, but Suhari who looked intimidated. Shenmei seemed to notice this. She turned a look on Suhari as if glaring at some filth on the ground. Of course I didn't trust him. How could I? My father's body was hardly cold before he took over headship of the family. Then he married the mother of this wench. Suhari was watching Shenmei, still shivering. Lulan giggled again and went over to Suhari. She took the hand of this sister from a different mother. She placed her other hand at Suhari's collar and tugged at something that dangled around her neck. It was very similar to Jinshi's own silver hair stick. and it hung from a string. But Jinchi's symbol depicted a killin, while Suhari's was in the shape of a bird. Those who recognized it would have known it was a phoenix. Like the killin, only a select few were entitled to wear that symbol. I guess His former Majesty must have felt guilty. He worried about the baby she had given birth to in the rear palace. It seemed he visited her often, thanks to his father's arrangements. Shishu was the one who had secretly sheltered the doctor and child after they were banished from the rear palace. As time passed, the child grew up. Shishu became the head of his family, and the young woman reached marriageable age. The emperor had once denied his daughter, but eventually he accepted that she was his. Do you know what he said to father? He asked if father would be so kind as to take his daughter as his wife. Shishu was trusted by the empress regnant, and was almost like family to the former emperor himself. Therefore, he must have seemed like an ideal son-in-law to the sovereign. The former emperor vowed to grant any wish Shishu might have. How then could he refuse? So the former head of the Shi clan, who had attracted such scrutiny from the empress regnant, died on his sickbed. Leadership then passed to Shishu, whom the empress regnant trusted. There was no longer a need to keep Shenmei as a hostage. The emperor had ultimate discretion as to what happened to the flowers of the rear palace. Shishu had married the sovereign's daughter, and a child had been born to them. They named her Shisui, granting her the clan name Shi. This woman is now known as Suhari, and so mother was graciously bestowed upon father. The former emperor was a foolish man. He completely failed to understand the effect this choice would have on his daughter. Suhari's mother died of illness soon after, and Suhari was taken in by the former rear palace physician. That man would later be hired and brought to this very fortress to create an elixir of immortality, but that is another story. About the same time the doctor took Suhari in, the former emperor began to seclude himself in his room. For more than 10 years until he died, there was no word from him. Having only one piece of silver jewelry, the girl who became known as Suhari never discovered she was the former emperor's granddaughter. After Lulan was born, she was treated as if she were no better than the child of a concubine. Even her name was taken from her and given to her newborn little sister. You are lying. That is enough mindless drivel from you. Shenmei, faced with the truth, backed away. The story must have been shocking for Suhari as well, but she appeared virtually unmoved. She kept looking uneasily at Shenmei. Perhaps Suhari had known this all along. Lulan, still smiling, approached Shenmei. Is that drivel, mother? And after father laboured the rest of his life for you, knowing all the while that it could only end in destruction. You do not even know why Master Jinchi is here, do you? She looked at her mother contemptuously, then turned to Jinchi. Tell us about the end of my father's life. He died laughing, Jinchi said. He did not know what the laughter had signified. He also did not know anything Shishu might have been thinking. After hearing Lulan's story, he began to sense a different perspective. He even wondered if he had been looking at the Shi clan's rebellion the wrong way. That man only wanted power. I am sure the only reason he even married me was so he could lay claim to the family headship. Shenmei's face contorted. Lulan smiled again. And yet within the clan, it was you who held sway, was it not, mother? Do you understand what kind of people those family members were, the ones who worked so hard to flatter you? They were fools, taking bribes and embezzling money. But they all tried to please Shenmei, knowing that if they had her favour, Shishu, the nominal head of the clan, would say nothing. He was simply an adopted son after all. He was a little boy who had come into the family. Despite his influence at court, his power within the clan was minimal. Shenmei systematically chased out anyone who said things she did not like. Eventually, there was nothing to check the rot. This was the source of a pernicious misunderstanding. What had been the motivation behind the expansion of the rear palace? And what was the motivation behind the embezzlement from the national treasury? These two matters should be viewed separately. They are not all the doing of the Shi clan. Lulan looked at Jinchi and smiled. She could see that he grasped what she was trying to say. The slave trade had been abolished when the current emperor took the throne. It continued underground, yes, but Shishu and the Empress Regnant had laid the groundwork. This allowed the system to be ended more or less easily. Now Jinchi was looking for something to replace it as the rear palace shrank once more. Even in this case, the Shi clan had managed to interfere. People always called my father a tanuki, but they forget that tanuki are cowardly creatures. They know they are secretly so small and weak, and that is why they try so hard to trick everybody. With that, Jinchi understood. He knew why Shishu had died laughing. It was because the cowardly tanuki had succeeded in deceiving everybody right to the very end. Did father play his part properly? Was he the villain he needed to be? Lulan asked, a smile flitting across her face. Jinchi at last understood what Shishu had been aiming for. He sought to become the necessary evil. He wanted to bring all the country's corruption together in one place. A role that could never be rewarded, and for which he would never be celebrated. Jinchi clenched his fist so hard that his fingernails bit into his palm, drawing blood. Do you have any proof that any of this is true? Was the corruption consuming the court from within largely eliminated, or wasn't it? How could you know your plan would work? If it didn't, we could always simply fall back on a coup d'etat. If a nation is weak enough to be dragged along by corruption like that, then better that it not exist. Lulan sounded almost off-handed. You were plotting this all along, Shenmei demanded, her voice trembling. You and him, you have been deceiving me this entire time. Deceiving you. I did exactly what you said, mother. Didn't you say this nation deserved to go to dust? You then chased out every fellow clan member who did not march to your tune. You surrounded yourself with sycophants who hung on your every word. Did you really think that a group like that could defeat the country's army? Shenmei looked furious at her daughter's harsh words. Finally, she jumped at Lulan. Her nail caps left 2 long red streaks down the side of her daughter's cheek. Is that not what these are for? Shenmei demanded. She had grabbed the fafer. That is more than you can handle, mother. Give it back, please, be quiet. But Lulan only chuckled mockingly. What is so funny? Shenmei snapped. Mother, you sound like a 2-bit thug. Shenmei's face twisted horribly and she fired the gun. Jinchi threw himself to the ground. Something flew past him with a very loud roar. Lulan thought, I am a bad daughter. If I truly wanted what father wanted, I could not have done this. Blood streaked Lulan's face. Shenmei across from her was absolutely covered in blood. In her hand was what remained of the exploded fafer. These new fafer are very complicated. That one was a prototype. She had only brought it along to intimidate Jinchi. It might have simply had stuffing inside. Didn't it ever occur to you to take it from me, Master Jinchi? Surely there would have been many chances if you had been looking for them. I assumed you had something you wanted to tell me. He, if only your pretty head were as empty as it looks. Laughing and still being rather rude, Lulan plucked the fafer out of Shenmei's blood-soaked hand and threw it away. She gently laid her mother down, holding her shaking hand. Father is dead. You could at least shed a tear for him. He was waiting for you all his life. If you had cried, I wouldn't have said what I did. Until the former emperor made his request, Shishu had remained completely chaste. She had not taken even a single concubine. The purity he felt could only come from a man whose heart still beat for the woman he had been betrothed to in his youth. Shenmei did not speak. She could not. Flying shards of metal had ravaged her face during the blast. No shadow of her former beauty remained, only a red mess. Suhari observed all this with trembling. There must have been another way, Jinchi said, getting to his feet. Maybe, Lulan replied, but it is hard to give everyone what they want. We are not wise enough for that. Shenmei was simply mean-spirited. She wanted to destroy the country that had made such a fool of her. Shishu did everything he did for Shenmei's sake. Even if it backfired on him, he did it all because of his feelings for her. He was also a loyal retainer, unable to abandon his country. Because of this, he had spent decades playing the villain, right to the very end. Jinchi could not tell what Suhari was thinking. Was this about appeasing the spirits of her mother and grandmother? Did she look somehow relieved as her empty gaze settled on Shenmei, gasping for breath? Or was that simply Jinchi's imagination? As for Lulan, she said, I know I am in no position to make demands, but perhaps I could request 2 favors of you. What are they? She asked. Lulan said first, bowing deeply, thank you. She knew she had no reason to expect Jinchi would listen to her. Then she took a piece of paper from the folds of her robe and handed it to him. He caught his breath when he saw what was written on it. What it said was unimaginable. Truly, she had hoped to use this to bargain for her life. But I do not think it would get me very far now. That paper reveals what is going to happen to this country. If the Shi clan still existed as it once did, they might have compounded the situation and destroyed the nation. Written on the piece of paper was a prediction of something far worse than this rebellion. Lulan's fingers brushed her mother's skin. Shenmei's breath was rapidly fading. She said, any members of our clan with any sense abandoned the Shi name long ago, and my older sister is the same. They've already died once, so perhaps I could ask you to overlook them. There was a beat. Jinchi said, I'll do what I can. Lulan repeated, seeking confirmation, you'll let the dead lie then.